If you grew up around the heavy land of eastern England, you'll remember the Doe Triple D, the sound before the sight, a doubled diesel thunder rolling across the fields, and then the machine itself, two whole tractors bolted back to back, folding round the headland like nothing else on earth. It was built in a single Essex village yard by a firm that had begun as a blacksmith shop, and it drove all four wheels with 100 horsepower, where Britain's best tractors managed barely 50. It pulled a 4-furrow plough through wet clay that stopped an ordinary tractor dead. It was sold to farms across 4 continents. A farmyard joke that became a machine the whole trade came to respect. And then, a little over a decade after the first one was built, the strangest tractor in Britain was simply gone. How does a machine that could do what nothing else could simply vanish from the fields in a handful of years? What happened to the Doe? Chapter 1. The Farmer and the Clay. The heavy land of central Essex has a way of humbling machinery. It's clay, dense, wet, and slow to drain. The kind of ground that clings to a plough and drags at a tractor's wheels until they spin in their own ruts. For centuries it had been broken by horses. By the 1950s, it was broken by tractors. But the tractors of that decade had a ceiling, and every farmer working that land knew precisely where it sat. Around 50 horsepower. 2 wheels driven, not 4. On a wet autumn morning, with the soil sodden and clinging, 50 horsepower through 2 driven wheels could pull a plough of 2 furrows. And that was the limit. The farms were growing. The war had taught Britain to squeeze every acre for food, and the men who came home wanted to farm at scale, to plough more ground in fewer days, to beat the weather instead of waiting on it. But the machines couldn't keep pace with the ambition. What the heavy land needed was power driven through all 4 wheels, a tractor that could put its strength into the ground rather than losing it to spinning. Nobody built such a thing. Not in Britain, not at a price a farm could bear. So one of them built it himself. His name was George Pryor, and he farmed at Navestock, a few miles south of Brentwood. In 1957, faced with a large acreage of that same stubborn clay, Pryor did something that ought to have been absurd. He took 2 Fordson Super Major tractors, ordinary machines, the workhorses of the age, and joined them together, one behind the other, in tandem. 2 engines, 2 sets of driven wheels, one enormous, improbable machine, twice as long as anything else in the yard and roughly twice as powerful. It worked. That was the astonishing part. On land where a single tractor bogged down and sat helpless, Pryor's tandem kept going, hauling its plough through the wet as if the clay were nothing. But it was crude. The steering, by Pryor's own admission, was a rough and ready thing, and in its earliest form the machine needed 2 drivers, one on each tractor, working in a kind of nervous coordination, each man trusting that the other was doing what he expected. It was less a machine than a conversation between 2 machines, conducted at full throttle across a muddy field. Word of it spread. In a farming county, a contraption like that doesn't stay quiet for long, and Pryor's twin Fordson became, as one account has it, the talk of the area. Farmers came to look. Some laughed. Some saw the sense buried inside the madness, that here at last was 4-wheel drive, even if it had arrived by the back door, lashed together from parts never meant to work this way. And one of the men who came to look was not a farmer at all. He was a dealer, a seller of tractors, out of a yard a few miles up the road at a place called Ulting. He looked at George Pryor's impossible machine, and where others saw a joke, he saw a product. To understand what he did next, you have to understand where he came from. Chapter 2. The Blacksmith of Ulting. The story of Ernest Doe and Sons begins, as so many do, with a young man taking a risk he could barely afford. In June of 1898, a 22-year-old named Ernest Doe took the lease of a blacksmith's shop at Ulting, near Malden, from a retiring smith called George Wood. The place sat at a bend in the road that would, in time, come to be known simply as Doe's Corner. More than a century later, it's still the company's home. A blacksmith in those years was the beating heart of a rural parish. He shod the horses that pulled the ploughs and the carts. He mended the tools, forged the hinges, set the iron tyres on the wheelwright's wheels, repaired whatever the land and its people wore out and brought to his door. The forge was where the district's iron problems came to be solved, and a good smith knew every farm for miles by the shape of the work it sent him. It was steady, skilled, respectable work, and Ernest Doe was good at it. In 1901, he married Alice Havis at Ulting Church, and in the years that followed, the family grew. First a son, Ernest Charles, born in 1904, then Hugh, then Herbert, always known as Bert. The smithy might have carried on in that quiet way for generations, shoeing horses until the horses were gone. But the horses were going, and the man who understood that first was not old Ernest. It was his son. By 1920, the boy Ernest Charles, Ernie to everyone, had seen something his father hadn't. After the Great War, a great many American-built Fordson tractors had been shipped to Britain by the Ministry of Munitions to keep the country fed, and now, with the fighting over, they were being sold off cheap. Ernie persuaded his father to buy some. It was a gamble on a future that hadn't quite arrived. The blacksmith's trade was the present. These strange, oily iron machines were a bet on what farming might become. Ernie won the bet, and then he kept on winning it. Through the 1930s, the firm sold tractors and implements, Fordsons and case machines, Ransom's ploughs, and from 1930 it bought its Fordsons direct from the Ford works at Dagenham, dealing with the manufacturer as an equal rather than through a middleman. In 1936, with their father's health failing, Ernie and Bert took over the running of the business between them, two brothers steering a firm their father had begun with a hammer and an anvil. Then came another war, and with it another surge of hunger for machines that could keep the fields in production. By 1941, the brothers were selling 240 tractors a year, crawlers among them, to farms across Essex and well beyond. Piece by piece, decade by decade, the horseshoeing smithy at Doe's Corner had become one of the largest machinery businesses in the whole of the east of England. In 1947, the firm was formally incorporated as Ernest Doe and Sons Limited, giving a legal shape to what was already a considerable concern. And in 1956, it took the step that would matter most for what came next. It became exclusively a Ford tractor agent. From that point on, Ford's machines were Doe's stock in trade, which meant that when a farmer arrived one day with two of them lashed together in an impossible tandem, Ernie Doe was looking at parts he already knew better than almost anyone alive. This is the thing to understand about Ernie Doe. He was not an inventor. He was a seller of other men's machines, and a very good one. But he had spent his whole life around tractors, watching them work and watching them fail, listening to farmers complain about what their machines couldn't do. And when he drove out to Navestock to see George Pryor's tandem contraption, he brought that lifetime of listening with him. Where a farmer saw a clever fix for his own fields, Ernie Doe saw something larger. He saw every heavy land farmer in Britain who'd ever cursed a bogged-down tractor. He saw a machine that did the one thing the whole industry had failed to deliver, real power through all four wheels, and he saw that it could be sold, if only it could be made to work properly, because Pryor's machine, for all its brute success, was still a two-driver monster with steering its owner had rigged himself, and nobody was going to buy that. So the two men reached an agreement. Pryor had the idea. Doe had the means to build it, sell it, and put it in front of the whole country. What neither of them had, yet, was a machine a farmer could actually drive. Turning George Pryor's brilliant, unruly monster into something one man could control would fall to a third figure, the man history has very nearly forgotten, and without whom none of it would have happened at all. Chapter 3. Making the Monster Behave. His name was Charles Bennett, and he was the service manager at Ulting, the man who ran the workshop, who understood how these Ford machines were bolted together and how they might be persuaded to do things Ford had never intended. Ernie Doe handed him the tandem problem, and Bennett and his team set about the engineering leap that everything else depended on, making one driver enough. The answer was hydraulics. The driver would sit on the rear tractor, and when he turned his wheel, hydraulic cylinders would relay that movement forward to the front unit. The whole machine bent in the middle, at the joint where the two tractors met. A great steel turntable that let the front swing relative to the back through something close to 90 degrees. Steer the back, and the front obeyed. Work the controls, and both gearboxes answered, more or less together. One man, two tractors, moving at last as a single machine. It is worth picturing what that meant in a field. When a Triple D came to the end of a run and turned at the headland, it didn't sweep round in a single arc the way an ordinary tractor did. It folded. The front unit swung out and away, while the rear held its line, the two halves hinging at the turntable until the machine had doubled back on itself and set off again down the next bounds. To a stranger leaning on a gate, it must have looked like two tractors having an argument. To the man on the back, it was simply his machine, obeying his hands through a web of pipes and rams that turned brute duplication into something that could be steered by one pair of arms. The crude two-man contraption that had needed a conversation between drivers now needed only a driver. In 1958, the first of them was finished and put on sale. Doe called it the Dual Power. It used two Fordson Super Major units, and together they produced something in the region of 100 horsepower, an almost unbelievable figure at a time when the biggest conventional British tractors made around 50. 2 engines, 2 gearboxes, 4 driven wheels, and a driver perched on the back of it all, commanding the lot. The following year, after further work on the controls, the machine was relaunched under the name it would carry into legend, the Doe Dual Drive. Farmers, with the instinct of people who don't much care for a mouthful, shortened it almost at once. Dual Drive, 2 Ds, and the tractor's own doubled nature seemed to demand a third. They called it the Triple D, and the name stuck fast. It was never a cheap thing to buy. The early Triple D carried a price of £1,950, the cost of a good many ordinary tractors, at a time when an ordinary tractor was what most farms could just about stretch to. But for the man with the acres and the heavy ground, the arithmetic worked in a way the sticker price concealed. A Doe did the work of 2 machines and the men to drive them. On the right farm, it didn't cost money. It saved it, 1 furrow at a time. It got better as it went. When the Fordson Super Major replaced the Power Major at the start of the 60s, Doe built its tandem around the newer units, tidied the layout, improved the way the 2 halves worked in concert, and nudged the power up past 100 and a bit. A further revision, a few years later, lifted it again. But the numbers, remarkable as they were, weren't really the point. The point was what those numbers did in a wet field, because the Triple D solved the farmer's problem so completely that it created a new one. Here was a wheeled tractor making 100 horsepower and more, and there was nothing on the market big enough for it to pull. The ploughmakers built for 50 horsepower machines, because 50 horsepower was what the world had. Nobody made a plough to swallow what the Doe could give, so Doe built its own. Out of the same yard that assembled the tractors came a whole range of gear designed to match them: mounted ploughs and semi-mounted ploughs, subsoilers to burst the hard pan deep beneath the surface, heavy cultivators, and great toolbars engineered to carry 2 ordinary implements side by side and work double the usual width in a single pass. It was a strange position for any machine to be in, so far ahead of the market that the market had nothing to hang off it. The maker of the tractor had to become the maker of everything the tractor pulled, simply so that its own creation would have something to do, and what it did on ground that had defeated everything before it. On heavy clay, the Triple D could haul a 4-furrow plough through the same land where an ordinary tractor strained and slithered and settled for 2. Twice the work, in 1 pass, in half the time. On the vast fields of the mechanizing post-war countryside, where a farm's whole fortune could turn on how much ground it could break in a narrow window of decent weather, that was not a convenience. It was a transformation. Word of what the mad machine could do travelled a great deal faster than the laughter ever had, and the orders began to come in. Chapter 4. The Golden Years at Ulting. There was something almost paradoxical about the enterprise at Doe's Corner in those years. Ernest Doe and Sons was a Ford main dealer, grown by now into the largest machinery retail organisation in the whole of East Anglia, in the straightforward business of selling Ford's tractors exactly as Ford made them. And yet, here it was, in the same yard, quietly taking those same tractors apart and building something Ford had never imagined and didn't sell. A machine assembled from Ford's own components that competed, in its way, with the humble 2-wheel drive tractors sitting out on the forecourt. A dealer and a manufacturer at once, which is a very rare thing for a firm to be, and rarer still for it to manage both without tripping over its own feet. The making of them was a workshop business, not a production line. There were no great stamping presses at Ulting, no assembly track carrying half-built machines past ranks of workers. A Triple D was built the way the firm's founder had once shod a horse, by hand, by men who knew the metal, taking 2 complete tractors and marrying them across that steel turntable with the slave rams and the linkages that made them one. Every machine that left the yard carried the fingerprints of the people who had built it, That was its glory, and in the end, it would prove part of its undoing. But in the golden years, it simply meant that a Doe was a thing made by craftsmen, in a village, for the hardest land in the country. The men who bought a Triple D were not, for the most part, small farmers. They were the operators of large arable acreages, the growers on the heavy clays and the drained fenland black earth, and above all the agricultural contractors, the men who owned no land themselves but hired their machines and their labour out across a whole district, working other people's fields for a price. For a contractor, time was everything, and the Doe gave him time. Through the autumn cultivations, when the whole rhythm of the farming year came down to a few short weeks of dry enough weather, a Triple D could be kept turning around the clock, one crew handing over to the next, the great machine barely cooling between shifts. To sit on one at night, in those years, was to know something few other men would ever know. One driver who ploughed with a Super Major Triple D in the early 60s left a memory of it that still carries. He worked the night shift, 8 in the evening until 8 the next morning. Early in the autumn, it was, he recalled, lovely work. The front of the open weather cab folded back, warm night air moving through, and above the diesel clatter a sound he never forgot, the deep and layered rumble of two engines pulling as one under a dark Essex sky. In winter, it was another thing entirely. Cold and wet and filthy, the front wheel running down in the furrow throwing up water, the whole machine low to a sodden ground that gave it very little room underneath. Now and then it would bog down for good in the small hours, and there was nothing for it but to leave the beast where it stood and walk home. The day shift would come out and winch it free behind an old field marshal. That cab was a Fritzmeier, a simple German weather frame, canvas and steel, not much more than a screen against the wind, offering the driver protection but not comfort in the modern sense. There was no hearing protection in that age, and none was thought necessary. A man simply lived inside the noise of his machine, and after a season the sound became so familiar that 30 years later he could summon it again at will. The blue and orange of the early livery, later blue and white. The sheer, ungainly length of the thing as it folded through its turn at the headland, the front tractor swinging out while the rear held its line. It was, by any sensible measure, a monster. The men who drove it loved it anyway. Another, who worked on a farm running one of the early orange-bonneted Triple Ds, remembered it with the same rough affection. It had, he admitted, all the faults of the first machines. It would break in half if you were careless with it, but it was easy enough to put right, and at that time it was very nearly the only way to get more than 100 horsepower onto a set of wheels at all. So they kept it, and they improved it, and between them they coaxed it up to something like 120 horsepower, a giddy figure for the day. Through the autumn cultivations it was double-shifted around the clock, one man climbing down as another climbed up, the engines scarcely allowed to go cold. That was the paradox of the Doe in a single machine, forever half a step from disaster, and yet indispensable, because nothing else on the market would do what it did. To stand at the edge of a field and watch one work was to witness something that had no right to exist, and yet plainly did. First you heard it. Long before you saw it come over the rise, the sound reached you across the open ground, that doubled diesel note, two engines beating not quite in unison so that the rumble seemed to fold over itself, a low continuous thunder that a man could feel in his chest as much as hear. Then the machine itself, impossibly long, hauling behind it a plough wide enough to turn 4 furrows at once, the black clay peeling back in glistening ribbons under a low autumn sky, the whole extraordinary length of it grinding forward at a walking pace it could hold all day and all night without complaint. There was nothing elegant about it. It was function made enormous, and there was a strange beauty in that, and it went out into the world. For a machine built in an Essex village yard, the Triple D travelled astonishingly far. Does went to Germany and to Ireland, to Sweden and to Nigeria, to Uruguay and to Russia, and across the Atlantic to the United States, with others finding their way to Holland, to Israel, to farms scattered across Africa and South America. Wherever there was land too heavy or too vast for an ordinary tractor and a farmer with the money to answer it, the mad machine from Ulting found a buyer. It was an unlikely export, this back-to-back oddity, and yet it carried the name of a former blacksmith shop to 4 continents. None of it had come from a drawing office at Ford, or from any of the great manufacturers who might have been expected to lead. It had come from a farmer's frustration at Navestock, and a dealer's eye at Ulting, and a service manager's ingenuity in a workshop. Charles Bennett engineered the machine and ran the works that built it, and he did so almost to the end of the tandem's best years, until his sudden death in 1963, far too young, in the middle of the very success he had made possible. The Doe family would say afterwards, plainly and without decoration, that without Charles Bennett it might never have happened at all. He belongs in this story beside Pryor, who dreamed it, and Doe, who dared to sell it, and he is the one most easily forgotten, because his work was the kind that hides itself inside the thing that works. By the middle of the decade, the Triple D had done something its makers could hardly have predicted at the start. It had stopped being a joke. The village firm that took 2 tractors and bolted them arse to arse had built a genuine reputation on the strangest premise in British farming, and it stood, in the winter of 1964, at the very top of what it could be. Chapter 5. The Summit at Smithfield, December 1964. The Smithfield Show in London, the great shop window of British agriculture, where every maker brought its best and its newest to be seen. And on the Doe stand that winter stood the most refined tandem the firm had ever built. They called it the Doe 130. It was built around 2 of Ford's brand new 5,000 skid units, and the name was simply arithmetic made flesh. 2 engines of around 65 horsepower apiece, and the sum of them written on the bonnet. 130 horsepower from a wheeled tractor, in an age when most of the country still ploughed with a third of that. Everything that had been awkward on the earlier machines was now smoother. The clutch, the gear change, and the steering all worked by hydraulics, so that the driver commanded both halves of his great articulated beast with something approaching ease. It was the mad idea at its most polished, and it wore a price to match. £2,850, a serious sum for a serious machine. The market answered at once. In the year that followed the launch, Doe sold 73 of them, and 14 of those went for export. For a specialist machine at that price, from a firm most of Britain had never heard of, those were remarkable figures, the sound of an eccentric gamble becoming, at last, an accepted part of the landscape. The impossible tractor had become respectable. Think of the distance travelled to reach that moment. A blacksmith's lease taken on a bend in the road in 1898. A farmer's frustration at Navestock, hammered into iron and lashed together in a yard. A service manager's ingenuity with pipes and rams, turning a 2-man joke into a 1-man tool. And now, at the great national showground, the finished expression of all of it, polished, powerful, selling, carrying the name of that former smithy in front of the whole of British farming. For the men on the Doe stand that winter, it must have felt less like a summit than like a beginning. Stand on that stand at Smithfield in the December of 1964, and everything points upward. The power, the polish, the orders coming in, the exports going out. A former blacksmith shop turned into a manufacturer with machines working on 4 continents, and a name that had begun as the punchline of a farmyard joke now spoken with respect across the trade. This was the summit, the highest point the strangest tractor in Britain would ever reach. Nobody on that stand could see the cliff, but it was there, and it was close, and the very future the Doe had proved that farmers needed was already being built in other men's workshops. The machine that had shown Britain the way to 4-wheel drive was about to be undone by 4-wheel drive itself. Chapter 6. 2 of everything. The genius of the Doe was also its curse, and the curse had been there from the very first machine. 2 engines, 2 gearboxes, 2 of everything, which meant 2 of everything to fuel, 2 of everything to service, and 2 of everything to go wrong. Consider the fuel alone. A single tractor burned what a single tractor burned. The Doe burned it twice over, 2 diesels drinking through a long day's ploughing where a rival ran one. Then the servicing. 2 engines to oil and tune, 2 sets of filters, 2 clutches, 2 of every wearing part, and, as anyone who has ever kept machinery running will tell you, twice the number of things waiting to fail at the worst possible moment. A machine with 2 of everything has, quite simply, double the chances of stopping. And keeping 2 engines pulling as one was its own quiet art. They had to be matched, tuned to run together, throttled in sympathy, so that neither dragged at the other nor fought it through the ground. A driver developed an ear for it, For the moment, one unit slipped out of step with its twin, the doubled rumble roughening into something not quite right. Get it right, and the machine sang. Get it wrong, and you were hauling 100 horsepower that was quietly at war with itself. And the driving was hard. Even in its refined form, the Doe asked a great deal of the man on the back. Changing gear meant coordinating 2 gearboxes at once, and on the early machines, the driver could manage the clutch and the high and low ranges on both units from his seat. But to select the forward gear on the leading tractor, he had to climb down, walk to the front, and do it by hand before climbing back up. A tractor you had to get off in order to drive properly was never going to be anyone's idea of easy. On the road, it was worse still. All that articulated length, hinged in the middle, made the thing a handful between fields. One contractor who drove them left the perfect verdict on the experience. Steering a Triple D down a lane, he said, was like pushing a rope. Anyone who has tried to push a rope will know exactly what he meant, and exactly how little of it went where you wanted. Then there was the danger. The machine was low to the ground and long, and if you were careless, too much throttle, the wrong ground, a load that fought back, it could rear or jackknife, the two halves folding against each other in a way no driver ever wanted to see. Under the rear unit, there was very little clearance, so that in the wet, it could belly down and stick where a taller machine would have kept going. Men learned to respect it. The ones who didn't learned faster. Doe knew all of this better than anyone and fought it at every turn. Each new version tidied the controls, smoothed the way the two halves worked together, worked the awkwardness out wherever it could be reached. The hydraulic clutch and gear change that made the 130 such a refined machine were, at bottom, an answer to the tandem's oldest complaint. The sheer difficulty of driving 2 tractors as though they were one. The firm poured its ingenuity into making the monster behave. What it could never do was make the monster simple. 2 engines would always be 2 engines. That much was written into the thing at birth. None of this, though, had mattered. That is the crucial thing to understand about the Doe's flaws in its golden years. Every one of them was the price of the only machine on Earth that could do the job. Double the fuel, double the servicing, the awkward gears, the rope-like steering, the jackknife lurking in a bad turn. A farmer swallowed all of it, gladly, because the alternative was 2 furrows instead of 4 and a tractor stuck fast in the wet. The faults were the toll you paid to cross a bridge that only Doe had built. But a toll is only worth paying while there's no other way across. And somewhere out beyond Essex, in a yard in Hampshire, a works in Middlesex, a factory in Gloucester, other men had looked at the same problem and begun to build a different bridge entirely. And there was a subtler weakness in the Doe, one that had nothing to do with fuel or gears or mud. It was this, a machine so specialized, so demanding and so expensive to run and to keep, could only ever make sense for the very largest and heaviest farms. Its market was narrow by its very nature. The big arable men, the drained fenland acres, the contractors with ground enough to justify the beast. That had been fine while the Doe was the only door into 4-wheel drive. A narrow market is still a market when you are the only one serving it. But a narrow market is a fragile thing. The moment a simpler, cheaper machine could do the same work for the same farms. The Doe's customers would have somewhere else to go, and nothing to hold them but affection. Affection has never yet balanced a farm's books. Chapter 7. The Rivals Who Killed It. The problem the Doe had answered by brute duplication, other men set out to answer by design. If a farmer needed 100 horsepower driven through 4 wheels, why give him 2 whole tractors when one, made larger and geared to drive all 4 of its wheels, would do the same work with half the machinery? It was not a mysterious idea. It was, in hindsight, the obvious one. The Doe's twin-engine layout had always been a workaround, a way of reaching 4-wheel drive before anyone had engineered a proper single-engine tractor to deliver it. The moment someone did, the workaround was finished. And in the middle years of the 1960s, 3 firms in particular set about doing exactly that. The first was County Commercial Cars, of Fleet in Hampshire, run by 2 brothers, Ernest and Percy Tapp. County had cut its teeth converting Fordson crawlers, taking Ford's skid units and turning them into tracked machines for the toughest going, and it moved from there to the thing that mattered most, equal-wheel 4-wheel drive from a single engine. Its Super 4 arrived in 1960, built around the same Fordson Super Major that Doe was bolting together in pairs. Where Doe took 2 super majors to reach its power, County took 1, drove all 4 of its wheels from that single engine, and asked the farmer to fuel, service and drive just the one machine. In time, County offered a 100-horsepower tractor of its own, and it went on to become the dominant name in British 4-wheel drive for the next 2 decades. It got there the hard way. 1 field, 1 farm, 1 sale at a time. Against the tandem it was quietly rendering obsolete. The second was Roadless Traction, of Hounslow in Middlesex, a firm with a long and distinguished pedigree that traced back to 1919 and a founder named Philip Johnson, a soldier and engineer who had spent his life on the problem of getting machinery across ground that fought it. Roadless built its Ploughmaster range, and the timing of it tells the whole story better than any argument could. Its earlier Ploughmaster had already put more than 70 horsepower through a single engine conversion. Then came the Ploughmaster 65, built on the very same Ford 5000 skid unit that Doe was using, and it went on sale in December of 1964. That was the same month, at the same kind of show, that Doe unveiled its own Ford 5000 machine, the 130. 2 firms, the same Ford components, the same season, and one of them needed 2 whole engines to make its case, while the other needed only 1. By 1968, Roadless 2 had an equal-wheel machine of well over 100 horsepower. The third was Muir Hill of Gloucester, whose 4-wheel drive tractor was developed by an engineer named David Brown. In 1966, Muir Hill launched its 101, 108 horsepower from a single engine at a price under £3,000. It was, in every way that a working farmer actually cared about, a plainer and simpler proposition than the Doe. 1 engine, 1 gearbox, 1 machine, no folding in the middle and no drama at the headland. And they were not the only ones. The idea was in the air now, and others reached for it. Northrop, building its own Ford-based 4-wheel drive tractors, and Mapbro, whose articulated Mastiff, appeared in 1967. The field that the Doe had once owned entirely, by sheer force of being the only machine that could do the job, was suddenly crowded with rivals, and every one of them had arrived at the same destination by a shorter and cheaper road. And that was the heart of it. Every one of these machines delivered 100 horsepower or more from 1 engine and 1 gearbox, 1 engine to fuel, 1 to service, 1 clutch, 1 set of gears, 1 seat from which a man could drive the whole thing without ever climbing down. No turntable, no folding through the headland, no jackknife waiting in a careless turn. Everything the Doe did, and none of the everything twice. Against machines like that, the Doe's brilliant contraption was suddenly on the wrong side of every sum. It cost more to buy. It drank more to run. It was harder to drive and more likely to break. The very qualities that had made it a marvel in 1958, the sheer doubled abundance of the thing, had become, by the late 60s, simply a list of disadvantages. Nothing about the Doe had changed. It ploughed exactly as well as it always had. It was the world around it that had moved, and a machine can be left behind without ever putting a foot wrong. What is hardest to take is how quickly it happened. This was not a slow eclipse across a generation, the long fade of an industry losing ground by degrees. In December of 1964, the Doe 130 stood at Smithfield as the last word in farm power, orders flowing in, a firm at the top of its game. By the spring of 1968, it was finished. Not 20 years, not 10, a little over 3. The same short span in which a young family might move house, or a boy might pass through the back end of his schooling, was time enough for the strangest tractor in Britain to go from the summit to the end of the line. The future did not creep up on the Doe. It arrived all at once, in a simpler shape, and it did not wait. There is a cruelty buried in the arrangement that makes it harder still to bear. County, the very firm leading the charge, was one of Ernest Doe's own biggest dealers. Doe sold County's machines, which means that on the forecourt at Doe's Corner and at the firm's other depots across the region, a farmer could stand between the two ideas and simply choose the elegant, single-engine County on one side, the mighty, thirsty, folding Doe on the other. And every County tractor that left a Doe yard was a small, quiet argument against the tandem the same company built in the shed round the back. Doe was, in the end, helping to sell the machines that were making its own creation redundant. It could hardly do otherwise. That was the business it was in, and it had always been a dealer first. But there is something almost unbearably poignant in a firm handing its customers, with one hand the very thing that would take the work away from the other. And then, gathering on the horizon, came one more pressure, not from a rival, but from the law. The industry was moving towards a requirement that every new tractor carry an approved safety cab, a frame tested to protect the driver if the machine rolled over. It was a good and necessary thing. Too many men had been killed beneath tractors that tipped. But for a maker turning out thousands of identical machines, developing and testing such a cab was a cost that could be spread thin across the whole run. For a machine built in ones and twos, in a village yard, with a shape like no other tractor on earth, it was a fixed and formidable expense, the kind of cost a dwindling specialist line simply cannot carry. The rules that would protect the men on the ordinary tractors were, for the extraordinary one, another weight on a scale already tipping the wrong way. Nobody, in all of this, did anything wrong. There was no villain, no greed, no blunder, no betrayal in a boardroom. The Doe was not brought down by a bad decision. It was overtaken by a better idea, arriving exactly when better ideas tend to arrive. And that is a far harder thing to mourn, because you cannot be angry at it. You can only watch the future come in its simpler shape and know what it costs, and there is one last twist of the knife in it, gentler and crueler than all the rest. The Doe had done the missionary work. For a decade it had gone out among skeptical, careful, tight-fisted farmers and proved to them, furrow by furrow, on the heaviest ground in the country, that four-wheel drive was real, that it worked, that it was worth the money. It had broken down the resistance. It had created the appetite. And when that appetite was ripe, the simpler machines walked in and fed on it. The pioneer clears the ground, others plant the crop and bring in the harvest. Every county and every roadless sold to a farmer who wanted four-wheel drive was, in some quiet way, a sale the Doe had made possible years before, by teaching a whole industry to want the thing in the first place. It had proved the case for its own successors, and then it had stepped aside for them, because it had to. Chapter 8. The firm lives, the machine dies. In May of 1968, production of the Doe 130 came to an end. 170 of them had been built. By the time the last left the works, the demand that had once made them respectable had fallen away almost to nothing. There was no single catastrophe, no announcement, no gates thrown shut. There was only the slow, quiet arithmetic of orders that stopped coming, because the market had found a simpler answer, and it was buying it somewhere else. After that, only 3 more tandem tractors were ever made. They were built on Ford's uprated Force 5000 units and badged as the Doe 150. 3 machines, a model that existed almost only as a name, the last flicker of an idea that the world had already moved past, and there is a final turn in the story that no scriptwriter would dare invent. The last of the tandems went to George Pryor, the man who started it all. He had never really let go of the idea. He had kept his own original monster, the crude twin Fordson from 1957, much modified and improved by Doe over the years, for a full decade, ploughing on with the machine that had started everything. He and his brother had each bought a new Triple D in October of 1961, so taken were they with what the finished production version could do. And in that final May of 1968, George Pryor bought a Doe 130, which he believed, to the end of his days, to be the very last tandem tractor ever to leave the works at Ulting. Think of the shape of that. The idea was born in a farmer's yard at Navestock, hammered together out of 2 ordinary tractors by a man who simply needed to plough his own heavy clay and could find nothing made that would do it. And 11 years later, it ended with the same man driving the last one home. The circle closed exactly where it had opened, in the hands of the farmer who had dreamed it. Doe made one further attempt to keep something of the spirit alive. In 1971 came the Doe 5100, no longer a tandem at all, but a single, stretched, strengthened tractor with 2 driven wheels and a big 6-cylinder Ford industrial engine of around 100 horsepower. It might, in another world, have carried the name forward into the new decade. But Ford, with its own new 7000 model waiting quietly in the wings, was unhappy to see a dealer building a rival to the machine it was about to launch. Only 6 of the 5100s were ever built, and with them the strange manufacturing adventure of Ernest Doe and Sons came gently to its close. After 13 years, the strangest tractor in Britain was no longer built by anyone. What ended at Ulting was not a factory. It was a way of thinking. It was the particular audacity that looks at an impossible problem and answers it not with patient engineering, but with sheer nerve. That says, if nobody will build you the machine you need, then take two of the machines you have and bolt them together and dare the thing to work. That kind of boldness belongs to a moment, the moment before the proper solution arrives. And when the proper solution comes, the boldness has nowhere left to live. It is a strange thing to grieve. Not a hardship, not an injustice, not a community thrown on the scrap heap. Just an idea whose time was brief and brilliant and over, the tractor equivalent of a wild, improbable sentence spoken once, perfectly, in a language that then fell out of use. But here, the story parts company with almost every other tale of British industrial loss, because the works did not fall silent, the gates did not rust shut. No hooter sounded a final time over men filing out for the last time. No community was left stranded around a dead factory. No town lost its reason to exist. There are no ghosts at Doe's corner. Ernest Doe and Sons did not close. The firm simply became again what it had always been beneath the adventure, a dealer, and a very good one. It sold the single-engine four-wheel drive machines, the county among them, that had bettered its own creation. It sold tractors and ploughs and combines and everything a modernizing countryside could want from it. And it did not merely survive. It went on, and it grew, decade after decade, until it stood among the largest machinery dealerships in the whole country. And consider what that meant for the men themselves. The fitters and mechanics who had married two tractors across a steel turntable, who had plumbed the hydraulics and coaxed the two engines into step. They did not walk out through the gates for the last time, redundancy money in a brown envelope, to a town with nothing left to offer them. They simply set down the work of building the monster and picked up the work of servicing everything else. The skills that had made the Doe found other uses under the same roof. There was no last shift, in the way that phrase has come to mean in 100 other British stories. The men who built the strangest tractor in Britain kept their livelihoods. It was only the tractor that was lost. The tragedy of the Doe, then, is not the tragedy of a company. It is the tragedy of a product and of an idea. The monster died so that the firm which made it could live. And of the two, if a man had to lose one, the machine was the one he could bear to lose. Chapter 9. Relics of a Mad Idea. The strange thing about this story is that there are no ruins to stand in. There is no derelict works at Doe's corner, no weeds pushing up through cracked concrete, no broken windows framing an empty sky, because the firm is still there, on the same bend in the road, still trading more than a century and a quarter after a young blacksmith took the lease. The ruins of the Doe are not a place. They are the machines themselves, scattered across the country, most of them long gone, a few dozen surviving, each one a relic of an idea the world grew out of. Roughly 300 tandem tractors were built, across all the versions, in all the years. Of those, only a handful still exist. One count put the number surviving in Britain at somewhere around 40. Enthusiasts' registers list 50 or more, though some of those have been rebuilt from a single surviving half, and some are replicas of a thing now too rare to find whole, from 300 down to that. It is the ordinary arithmetic of what happens to machines nobody makes anymore. The scrapman, the hedgerow, the slow surrender to rust, until what was once a common working sight becomes a thing men drive halfway across the country to stand and look at. From 300 to a few dozen to treasure. And yet, of all the fates that might have befallen the weirdest tractor ever built, it became treasure. At a Sheffins sale in May of 2024, a Doe Triple D from 1964, in fully original condition, still carrying its original engines, with 6,650 hours on the clock, sold for £70,000. At the same sale, a Triple D from 1963 made £60,000, a Doe 130 from 1967, £45,000, an early dual power believed to be one of only 6 ever built, £42,000. And a few years earlier, the Doe 130 that had been sold new to George Pryor himself, believed to be the last tandem out of Ulting, made £71,000 under the hammer. Set that against the sticker price. £2,850 new in 1964, 70,000 and more half a century on. The machine that the market made obsolete is now worth more than it ever was when it was the last word in farming power. Nor is the Doe alone in this. The whole vanished world of British four-wheel drive has become treasure in the same way. The very county machines that once undercut the Doe are prized now as fiercely as the tandem they beat. One rare example, fetching more than £200,000 at auction not long ago. The machines that fought each other for the heavy land in the 1960s sit side by side in the sale rooms today, all of them worth fortunes, all of them gone from the fields they were built for. Time is an odd sort of leveller. It takes the winners and the losers alike and turns them together into relics. It has its afterlife in motion too. There is a display team called the Dancing Does, a troupe of the great articulated beasts that perform synchronized routines at shows, folding and wheeling in time to music, all that ungainly length turned somehow into a kind of grace. They appear at the tractor shows and the ploughing matches, at Malvern and Newark and the Great Dorset Steam Fair, drawing crowds who come precisely because there is nothing else on the field remotely like them. Children who have never seen a horse-drawn plough, whose parents were not yet born when the last 130 left Ulting, stand at the ropes and watch 2 engines and 8 wheels move as one, and something of the old astonishment passes to them intact. A small model of a dual drive, built to 1/12 scale, sits in the Science Museum's collection. The cutting edge of 1964, preserved now behind glass, an oddity to be looked at rather than a machine to be used. The story has been kept, too, by those who cared enough to write it down. The historian Stuart Gibbard set out the whole of it in a book, patiently gathering the dates and the numbers and the names before the men who remembered them were gone. It is a particular kind of devotion that, to sit with a subject the wider world calls a curiosity and treat it as something worth the truth. Without it, a great deal of this would already have slipped away. The Doe was never beaten. That is what stays with you at the end. It did not fail. It was not badly built, or badly run, or badly sold. It did precisely what it had promised. It put 100 horsepower and more onto 4 wheels, and it broke the heavy land that had beaten everything before it. It proved, beyond argument, that British farmers needed four-wheel drive, and in the very act of proving it, it summoned the simpler, cheaper, single-engine machines that made it, almost at once, unnecessary. There is a particular sorrow in that, quite different from the sorrow of a thing that fails. It is the sorrow of a thing that succeeds so completely it argues itself out of the world. George Pryor's monster, lashed together in a Navestock yard to plough one stubborn farm, ended its days in a museum and in a sale room, and in the memory of every man who ever sat on the back of one at night and felt 2 engines thunder up through the frame beneath him. The firm that dared to build it lives on, the 5th generation of the family at its head now, Ernest Doe leading the company, his father Colin as chairman, still on that same corner where it all began in 1898. The blacksmith shop outlasted the marvel by half a century and more. But on a summer afternoon, on a show field somewhere in England, when someone climbs aboard a Triple D and 2 old diesels catch and settle into that doubled, folding, unmistakable rumble, you can still hear it for a moment, the sound of the strangest idea in the history of British farming. It is not the sound of a factory, or a fortune, or a nation's industry. It is smaller and stranger than that, and in its way more moving, the sound of one man's answer to one field of heavy clay, grown for a few short years into a marvel, and now kept alive only by love, loud, magnificent, and gone.